My name is Alyssa Bruno, and I'm the School Programming Coordinator here at Historic Huguenot Street. Welcome to another digital read-along. Last week, we read the second part of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights by Anne Kama, with permission of Scholastic Books. If you've not already watched the first and second installments of this reading, check out the videos from the previous 2 Mondays on our Facebook page. In the last segment, we learned about the beginning of the women's rights movement, its initial successes, and the women behind it all. Today, we will read the book's final installment and learn about how the movement progressed from the early days and how women finally won their rights. Enjoy. How did pioneers in the West find out about the women's movement? In the 1800s, there was no television or radio. Women leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton traveled all over the West giving speeches about women's rights. The pioneers loved it when speakers came to their little towns. That's how they learned about the outside world. The speaker might be a general, an actor, or someone with radical new ideas. To the pioneers, it was all great fun. But it wasn't easy for speakers to get those small towns. When it rained, the unpaved roads turned into mud. Then it was hard for the stagecoaches to get through, and rivers froze, sometimes trapping boats in ice for hours. When big snowstorms hit, the train stops running. That's what happened once to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's train. But she had to be in the next town that evening to give a speech, so she hired a horse-drawn sled. Bundled up in a fur coat with a thick scarf over her head and face, and a heated wooden board under her feet, she was ready. The driver threw a large buffalo robe over her and tied the 2 buffalo tails around her neck. If you sit perfectly still, you'll come out all right. In spite of huge snowdrifts and freezing winds, the sled made it across the prairie in 6 hours, just in time for Elizabeth's 8 o'clock speech. How did women get the vote in Wyoming? Before Esther Morris moved to Wyoming, she lived in the East, where she had heard Susan B. Anthony speak. In 1869, Esther invited some politicians over for tea at her home in South Pass City. She wanted to talk to them about giving Wyoming women the vote. Those against women voting said that men were often drunk and rowdy at the polls. Women were too delicate, they said, to vote in such a rough male world. Besides, women weren't smart enough. But Esther disagreed. If you give Wyoming women the vote, she said, more women will want to come here and settle. And Wyoming needs more settlers. We have too many rowdy miners, cowboys, railroad workers, and gamblers who never stay in one place. She also said that if women could vote, they would vote for law and order, and Wyoming was a lawless place in 1869. The politicians agreed. That same year, Wyoming became the first place in America to give women the vote. Was there trouble when the women voted? No. Whenever a woman approached the voting place, word would go out, "Psst, be quiet, a woman is coming," and the men would respectfully let her pass. It was the quietest election anyone in Wyoming had ever seen. What did women do during the Civil War? During the Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, women stopped working for their own rights. Because men were away fighting, women on both sides, the North and the South, ran farms and businesses. They worked the men's jobs to support their families. Women also provided most of the food, clothing, and medicine for the 2 armies. They trained nurses and ran army hospitals. Clara Barton nursed soldiers on some of the bloodiest battlefields of the war. She didn't care if the wounded men were from the North or South. They all deserved medical care. After the war, she started the American Red Cross, which still helps people when the disaster strikes. Why were women's rights leaders upset after the war? After the Civil War, the Constitution was changed to allow African American men the vote, but not women, black or white. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were furious. For 16 years, the women's rights movement had fought for the right to vote, and they had fought hard to end slavery as well. Finally, there was a chance to change the Constitution so that both women and African Americans could vote. Instead, women were told to wait. Even most anti-slavery leaders agreed. Sojourner Truth didn't agree. "There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights," she said, "but not a word about colored women." She warned, "If the colored men get their rights, and not the colored women, the colored men will be the masters over the women." Sojourner worried about something else too. If women didn't get the vote now, it might be a long time before they had another chance. She was right. It took 53 more years. Both Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton died without ever having a chance to vote. Susan B. Anthony did vote, once. When she was 53 years old, Susan talked a voting inspector into her letting her vote in a presidential election. But soon afterward, she was arrested for breaking the law. There was a trial. The judge wouldn't even let Susan speak. The judge found her guilty and told her to pay a fine of $100. Susan said she would not pay, and she never did. Two years later, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, declared that the Constitution did not give women the right to vote. It was up to the states to decide who should vote, the court said. When women heard this, they began a long fight to change the Constitution. How did women speakers help change America? In the 1870s, most people had never actually heard a woman speak about women's rights. Newspapers called women speakers female monsters. So, imagine how surprised an audience was when Elizabeth Cady Stanton stepped up to speak. By now, she was a plump little woman with pretty gray curls who looked like a cheerful grandmother. She was funny when she spoke, and she made a lot of sense. Even those who didn't agree with her often respected her. For many years, speakers such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton traveled across the country. Slowly, more and more people began to agree that women should have equal rights. Newspapers and politicians began to show more respect, and to take women's rights more seriously. By 1900, things were a lot different and better for women in the United States. But there was one thing most women still didn't have: the right to vote. How did suffragists in England help? By 1910, it looked like most American women would never get the vote. Only a few states had given women the vote. New ideas were needed. Something new was happening in England. Suffragists there had decided they weren't going to wait quietly any longer. Without equality, there would be no peace. They interrupted government speakers, heckled politicians, and held noisy meetings on the street corners and in parks. Police and bystanders often attacked them. Many protesters were arrested and put in jail. Some suffragists set mailboxes on fire, cut telephone wires, and threw rocks through government building windows. In England, nobody could ignore women's suffrage anymore. An American, Alice Paul, had worked with English suffragists and liked some of their ideas. Now she was coming home to continue the fight. Why did Alice Paul organize a march in Washington, D.C.? Alice Paul wanted Congress to change the Constitution so that all women could vote. That's why she planned a big march in Washington, D.C., something women had never done before. As thousands of women from all over the United States marched peacefully down Pennsylvania Avenue, they were attacked by an angry mob of men. Police refused to protect the marchers. Finally, a group of male students in the crowd locked arms and formed a protective chain around some of the women. By the time the U.S. cavalry arrived to restore order, hundreds had been injured. Newspapers and the public were shocked at the way the women had been treated. People began to pay more attention to the suffragists, and many more women joined the movement. What did Alice Paul do next? On a cold January morning in 1917, 12 women unfurled their banners in front of the White House, where President Woodrow Wilson lived. "How long must women wait for liberty?" read one banner. "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" another started. Alice's next plan had begun. Picketing the White House was something new. The women stood on the sidewalk, silently holding their banners. At first, nobody bothered them. But things changed when America entered World War I 3 months later. President Wilson said America was fighting the war in Europe to make the world safe for democracy. People, he said, should have a voice in their own government. That's what the suffragists thought, too. Soon there were banners in front of the White House asking the President Wilson why he supported democracy for people in Europe, but not democracy for American women. The president was embarrassed and angry. Onlookers attacked the picketers and called them unpatriotic. Did the police arrest the attackers? No. They arrested the women. Their crime? Blocking traffic. They weren't even guilty. It was the crowds that blocked traffic. But hundreds of women were arrested and sent to jail. What was the Night of Terror? Each day, more and more women were put in jail. Then, on November 15, 1917, the prison guards decided to teach the women a lesson. In a rage, they hurled one woman into a cell, smashing her head and knocking her out. Her cellmate, who thought she was dead, had a heart attack. Another woman was thrown through the air, hitting the cell wall. Others were shoved and thrown and knocked down. It became known as the Night of Terror. In protest, Alice Paul and the other women in jail went on a hunger strike, so the prison officials forced them to eat. Guards pushed tubes down the women's throats and poured food down the tubes. It was very painful. The prison also tried to have Alice, their leader, declared insane so they could send her to the mental institution. Luckily, the psychiatrist brought in to examine didn't agree. He said that she wasn't crazy, she was just brave. When word got out about how the women were being treated, people were horrified. All the women were released from jail. In spite of their suffering, the suffragists had won a big victory. Now, even more people supported them. When did women get the right to vote? To change the Constitution, 36 states had to vote to approve the amendment. On August 18, 1920, all eyes were on Tennessee. 35 states had already approved the 19th Amendment to give women the vote. America's women were just one state away from victory. But how would the Tennessee lawmakers vote? Everyone knew it would be close. One lawmaker was brought from the hospital to cast his vote. Another rushed to vote before going home to his dying child. Just when it looked like the amendment would fail, Harry Burns stood up. In his pocket was a letter from his mother. "Hurrah, and vote for suffrage," it said. Harry voted yes, and with that, 27 million American women got the constitutional right to vote. That fall, women across the country went to vote for the first time in American history. The fight had lasted 72 years, so long that only one woman from the Seneca Falls Convention was still alive. She was Charlotte Woodward, the young glove maker. When she cast her ballot, she was 91 years old. Thanks for tuning in and reading the last part of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights with me. If you want your very own copy of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights, you can purchase it in our online shop. You will receive 10% off the book's original price of $7.99 at checkout today through Sunday, May 10th. This will bring the cost of the book to $7.19 before taxes and shipping. If you live locally, you can arrange to come pick the book up instead of having it shipped. Thank you again for your interest in Historic Huguenot Street. I hope to see you again next Monday at 10 a.m. for Historic Huguenot Street's very first craft demonstration.